Hi, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner. Welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. We're going to have a really fantastic show tonight, and I'm so pleased that my guest, Carey Gillam, could join us tonight to talk about her book called Whitewash, the story of a weed killer, cancer, and the corruption of science. How are you doing tonight, Carey?
Hi, I'm very excited to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
Yes, well, I just finished your book and it's so exciting. It's a real page turner, getting into all these ramifications that I want to start right into the subject. But first, I just want to read your bio here in the sleeve of the book. Carey Gillam is a veteran journalist, researcher, and writer with more than 25 years of experience covering corporate America, food, and farming. A former senior correspondent for Reuters International News Service, Gillam was instrumental in bringing the dangers of glyphosate to public attention. So we're going to talk about glyphosate. That's going to be my second question, but I have to point out that I found it very interesting, being that I've been eating organic for so many decades and I'm very concerned about these things, that I read that you actually did not eat organic. You were not necessarily concerned about chemicals in your food, and you actually used the product Roundup, which we're going to be talking about tonight. So tell us about how you got interested in covering this story and ultimately writing this book.
Sure. So I've been a journalist for 30 years and I was covering the banking industry. I covered commercial real estate, healthcare. I didn't know really hardly anything about food and agriculture. And in 1998, Reuters assigned me to move to Kansas City and start learning and writing and reporting and researching about food and farming. And that was my first entry into it. I thought, wow, this is going to be really boring, right? I've been covering the big, exciting world of banking. But it was 1998. Monsanto had just introduced genetically engineered crops. It was revolutionizing, the way that farmers planted and handled their crops. And it was my job to learn everything about it. And it's, has substantially changed my view now, of course, of food and how it affects our health and how it affects our environment.
Okay, well, let's talk about Monsanto. How big a company is it? How important is this product, Roundup? What is Roundup? And talk about glyphosate, the main ingredient of Roundup. And then what happened when the patent was expiring on Roundup and they developed Roundup Ready seeds.
Sure. So Monsanto, you measure them by sales, annual sales revenues. Monsanto's 13, 14 billion. They got about 15 billion in sales annually. The company used to be more of an industrial chemical company, but it moved over to be a pure ag company. Oh gosh, how long has it been now? 18 years or so. Their main chemical was this chemical called glyphosate. It was an herbicide that they brought to market in 1974. They branded it as Roundup. It revolutionized farming. It was safer, more effective, really easy to use, and it killed a broad array of weeds. When they brought it to market, farmers loved it. It was used by utilities and parks and playground management, homeowners. But the patent was expiring in the year 2000, as you mentioned. And so Monsanto needed a way to keep a hold of that market, to have farmers and others continue to buy Roundup. So in the 1990s, they rolled out these specialty crops, patented, genetically engineered crops designed to do one thing, to be sprayed directly with Roundup and not die. And farmers loved it. It made their job a lot easier, and it locked in profits and market share for Monsanto. So that's how this has really become so pervasive in our world, because use exploded. It's now used on more than 70 different food crops. It's found in our food, our water, our soil. It's found in our own body. It's ubiquitous. It's pervasive.
Okay, before we talk about the health effects of glyphosate and the fact that it has been deliberately untested for most of its 40 years. Let's try to personalize this story. They told farmers that it was as safe as table salt. You have a lot of sad stories about farmers in here that you interviewed. Tell us about Jack McCall.
Oh, Jack McCall. Breaks my heart, Jack McCall. Jack McCall is the first anecdote in my book, really. He and his wife, Terry McCall, had a beautiful farm in Cambria, California. I mean, just like out of a movie. They grew citrus crops and avocados and different fruits, and just had a beautiful little farm. He didn't want to use pesticides at all. He sold his fruits at local farmers markets. He, installed panels, solar panels, just really tried to be sort of natural and healthy. But he did use Roundup because he was told and he believed it was very, very safe. And he would spray it himself from a backpack applicator, and his dog would romp along beside him. It wasn't after too many years of using Roundup exclusively that the family dog, developed lymphoma and died. And then Jack himself developed non-Hodgkin lymphoma, a pretty serious and very aggressive form. And, it just took this healthy, robust man who, a Vietnam War veteran. He never smoked. He was very healthy, and took him down. And he died the day after Christmas of 2015.
And then in the epilogue of the book, you write about his wife who developed breast cancer.
Right. Terry then herself, as she was struggling in the aftermath of his death, found herself with breast cancer, and has been battling that, but seems to be on the mend. But Jack is just one. There are many other people, that I mentioned in the book. Thousands of people around the United States are now suing Monsanto, alleging that exposure to Roundup caused them to develop non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And Terry's one of the plaintiffs in this litigation.
Yeah, we'll be talking about the litigation later in the show, but what are some of the other health effects, or is it mainly non-Hodgkin's lymphoma?
Well, non-Hodgkin lymphoma is the focus of the litigation because that is what the International Agency for Research on Cancer found the most strongest positive association with that particular disease. But scientists around the world, research has been done looking at, kidney issues, liver effects, reproductive effects, a whole array of human health problems and ailments that could result from exposure to glyphosate. And they're looking at toxicology, studies in animals, laboratory animals, and they're also looking at epidemiology. There was a recent government-related study that came out that found an association to acute myeloid leukemia as well. So people are very concerned about it, but the science is not definitive.
Yes, well, that's the problem. When you and I talked in the pre-interview, we talked about correlation versus causation. Right. And I had read a book called Parts Per Billion, The Poisoning of Beverly Hills High, because there's an oil well. They finally shut it down after decades, but there's an oil well on the high school property, and the English department windows faced out onto that oil well. And those English teachers were coming down with a disproportionate number of cases of Hodgkin's lymphoma, non-Hodgkin's, all those things. And they actually got Erin Brockovich and her firm to sue the school district and the city. And what I read in that book, it's a great book also, was that you can only prove correlation. You can never prove causation because the person that got the disease might have been exposed to it in a previous job or at a previous residence, or they might have be genetically disposed to it, that type of thing. So talk about let me backtrack a little bit.
Okay.
Talk about why this got into the news after decades of not studying it. What did people do to make this an issue? I found out about the March on Monsanto during the Occupy movement back in 2011. Yeah. And I go to those annual marches, and several times I was asked to talk about the TPP, which was this trade deal that if it passed, it would make bans on glyphosate or GMO labeling laws unenforceable because they could sue them. Monsanto could sue these nations or these municipalities or states for a loss of expected future profits. So I wasn't one of those people that was all hepped up about GMOs. I had heard, oh, the scientists don't really think they're that bad. They've been breeding plants for years. I was concerned more about Monsanto, evil company. They sue they sue farmers for replanting their seeds, which is an age-old practice, et cetera, et cetera. But, over the years, I've become much more concerned. And of course, reading your book now, it's just like frightening. So what happened? What happened out there in the country? Talk about some of the heroes of the movement that brought this issue to light.
Sure. Well, that's a lot of questions right there.
Yeah, I know. I tend to do that.
So, there's so many issues that so many people are concerned about with Monsanto. The GMOs, as you said, was one issue. A lot of people were concerned about the genetically engineered crops and effects on human health, effects on farmers, saving the seed, et cetera, et cetera. But over time, from the time that they were introduced into the mid-90s until now, with this surge of glyphosate and Roundup, the focus has ever increasingly been on this widespread use of this herbicide. And so more researchers around the world were looking at it, right? And looking at the effects on the environment, on biodiversity, on the soil, on our health. And so what happened was in 2014, the International Agency for Research on Cancer decided to take a look at all of this research on glyphosate because it was so widely used, and determine how to classify it, if it's a probable human carcinogen or not, or possible or not likely, to look at all of this body of literature. And that's what they did. And when they put it all together, they didn't say definitely, they didn't say definitely not, but they came up with probably, which is, and they are the esteemed elite scientists that regulatory agencies around the world rely on to identify cancer hazards. And usually when they do that, people respect and look at what they have come up with a high regard. But Monsanto took a different tactic and has been working, diligently now for 3 years to discredit and silence these international cancer scientists, so much so that they have actually convinced several of our lawmakers now in Washington, D.C. to move to try to strip funding from this International Agency for Research on Cancer, which I find to be particularly worrisome, outrageous.
Yeah.
Because cancer, we need more money for cancer research and cancer resources and cancer hazard identification, not less. But because of Monsanto and because of this classification, our government is working now to try to take money away from these cancer experts. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's...
We'll get to the heroes of the movement later in the show. I kind of took that question out of order. But let's talk about now how the EPA, the USDA, and the FDA have colluded with Monsanto to whitewash, the title of your book, the effects of glyphosate. How have they been able to infiltrate these agencies? And what happens when there are good employees there that really try to do their jobs?
Yeah, well, gosh, there's so many examples we could talk about. I think the best one is perhaps dating back to 1983 with this first mouse study, that Monsanto actually itself paid to have conducted, brought to the EPA and said, here you go, this demonstrates the safety of our product. It was a 2-year-long mouse study. But when the EPA toxicologists looked at it, the scientists within EPA, they said, no, this looks like it causes cancer. Here, these mice who've been exposed to glyphosate are developing all of these rare tumors. So this looks like this could cause cancer. And Monsanto set about then going over the heads of these EPA scientists and essentially discrediting and overruling them and getting higher up EPA officials to overturn that decision. And it took them several years to do it, but they did. And you've seen that time and time again. Whenever an EPA, USDA, and FDA scientist tries to raise alarm bells and tries to say, here's what our science is showing, here's the concern for human health, Monsanto gets it shut down. And they're not unique in that form. Dow Chemical certainly has a lot of power. A lot of other big corporate, powerhouses carry a lot of weight in Washington, D.C. I don't think anybody finds that surprising. But what the result is, it manifests in decision-making within our regulatory agencies that benefits these public corporations and benefits their bottom line and their profit stream to the detriment of public health. And that's what we see time and time again. And we've seen that with Monsanto and EPA, so much so that there's an investigation ongoing. We believe it still is. It was launched not too long ago by the Office of Inspector General, specifically looking at collusion between top EPA officials and Monsanto.
Wow. And there was a guy by the name of Jess Rowland, or
Right.
Rowland. Can you talk about him? He seemed particularly nefarious.
Well, and who knows, right? I mean, Jess Rowland was, again, a long-term high-ranking official at EPA. He seemed to be, well, Monsanto in their internal emails refer to him as a friend and someone who can be useful to them in defending glyphosate. He chaired the Cancer Assessment Review Committee. He was one of the people in charge of that, finding that glyphosate was not likely to be carcinogenic. He also, if you go back years and years and years, see that he was instrumental in the EPA decision not to include an extra safety margin for children when they set requirements, for allowances for how much glyphosate can be in your food, for instance. There's supposed to be an extra safety margin for children to protect them from pesticide residues in their foods, but he essentially championed a move to disregard that extra safety margin and eliminate that in the case of glyphosate. So, and there's lots of memos. There's a memo where he's talking about a Monsanto employee is saying that Jess says, he should get a medal for trying to kill a toxicity review of glyphosate. That Monsanto wanted to go away, that actually did then go away.
Yeah. Now, talk about the role of the so-called independent scientists and the independent studies, because it's always easy to say that, that study showing that it's perfectly fine is paid for by Monsanto. But they have a way of hiding what they pay for and calling them independent studies. What have you found out about that?
Yeah, I mean, what we found through the documents, what we found through both internal documents that have come out from inside Monsanto through discovery and litigation, and then through Freedom of Information Act requests, what we find is that they seem to have a pattern of paying scientists to put their names on papers and sign these papers and maybe have some input into these research papers. But Monsanto ghostwrites them, and Monsanto's own officials use the term ghostwriting, ghostwritten. We ghost wrote this paper. So in effect, it's a paper that declares this chemical to be very, very safe, not have any reproductive harmful impacts, not have any carcinogenity impacts. It's great. And you look at the paper and it looks like it's been written by independent scientists. You don't see that Monsanto actually was behind it. Unless you see these internal documents. And so that's very alarming, because some of these papers that we know that Monsanto had a hand ghostwriting in, have been cited by the EPA as what they're relying on in their own determinations of glyphosate safety.
Mm-hmm. Now, all this was supposed to change under Obama, of course. You write in your book what we all heard, that science was going to take a front seat, and science was going to drive the policy, and it didn't actually turn out that way. And in fact, it was him that appointed Michael Taylor head of FDA, wasn't it? It wasn't Trump. I thought it was Obama. Am I wrong?
I thought he was there before Obama, but I could be wrong. He's been in and out of government, Michael Taylor. He's bounced back and forth 2 or 3 or 4 times now. Between the corporate world and the regulatory world. And,
I should have said he used to work for Monsanto. Yes.
He was a Monsanto attorney, and then he was at FDA. He was at FDA, for quite some time, because I have documents where he was quite interested in some of the Monsanto glyphosate issues where they were getting him involved. But to answer your question, Obama did, when he came in, implemented and pushed new scientific integrity policies to try to protect scientists within the organization from political pressure and political manipulation. But if you look at surveys and information that comes from those same scientists, they tell you it's nothing really improved. It's been the political pressure and manipulation and censoring of hardworking scientists, has been ongoing through Republican administrations and Democrat administrations and continues to this day. And if I could point out one really strong example right now, Linda Birnbaum, who is essentially our nation's top toxicologist. She runs the National Toxicology Program. She runs the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences. She has recently been trying to call out for more protective health policies and saying our science is not caught up. We are not protecting the public from these chemicals. And instead of embracing that and saying, what can we do? Again, our lawmakers are trying to shut her up. They've called for her to be investigated. They've called for her to lose her job. Her emails are all being sought. She is on a hot seat because she has called for protective health policy to protect the public.
Wow. Well, I'm sure all of this is getting worse under Trump, because we know how horrible Scott Pruitt is, for one. Is the same horrible things happening in the FDA and the USDA that affect glyphosate? Any progress that we may have made? Is it being rolled back under Trump?
Progress. Well, I don't know if we made progress. I mean, the FDA and USDA don't test for glyphosate residues in our foods, really. I mean, the FDA they finally said they would start to do that in 2016. This is the most widely used agrochemical, in the world. It's on so much of our food. The USDA and FDA are supposed to every year test thousands of food samples specifically to see if pesticide residues are at levels that are considered safe or unsafe, and they always have skipped Monsanto's Roundup. They've always skipped glyphosate. The USDA continues to skip that. FDA said they were going to start testing in 2016. They did some testing until one of their chemists found it pretty prevalently in honey and oats and things like that. They suspended the program. They shipped that chemist off. They said he's not going to do any more food residue testing for them. Now they've resumed it, sort of, but they're not really telling us the results yet. They're not being accountable to the public. They are dodging and hiding, and they don't want to answer questions. And we have to get our information from Freedom of Information Act requests, which you really shouldn't have to do that. They should be forthcoming.
You just did that, and you got some internal memos that you wrote an article about in The Guardian last week. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, this was the latest. I sort of keep rolling requests going for internal FDA documents to try to track what they've been doing. And this latest batch of Freedom Information had a really interesting one. It came from another chemist, this one from a lab in Arkansas, who was he wanted to do this glyphosate testing, but he needed foods that were free of glyphosate, so he could compare. He needed basically to get his testing perfected. So he needed to find foods that were free of glyphosate. And he's writing this internal email saying he can't find any. He's bringing stuff from home, crackers and granola and all sorts of things like that. And everything's got glyphosate in it. And he said the only thing he could find that didn't have glyphosate was broccoli.
I hate broccoli.
And then there was another memo where a scientist is saying he's found illegal levels of glyphosate in some corn. And his supervisor is essentially saying, well, it's not going to matter because we're not going to count that. We're not going to consider that as an official sample. We're just going to, not pay attention to that. So, so there was a little story I wrote in The Guardian, but that's just one in a long string of things that this stuff is everywhere. It's in our food. It would be really useful if the government would track it, and we could have a database and monitor this pesticide that we're all consuming on a daily basis.
Now let's talk about some of the other things that Monsanto does to push back against the effort for the people that want to label GMOs, the Right to Know movement, the people that are trying to ban glyphosate. You know, we talked a little bit about the independent studies.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the astroturf groups, the mommy blogs. You even wrote, I thought this was so funny, that glyphosate has its own Twitter account.
I know. Isn't that crazy? So, well, Monsanto is probably the best at it, I think. You know, again, it's not just Monsanto. You know, the chemical industry does this. Tobacco did it. I mean, but Monsanto's pretty savvy. They've helped set up or help fund or in other ways help back a whole array of, you can call them astroturf. I refer to them as front groups, organizations that look to be, you know, very science oriented, the American Council on Science and Health, you know, the Campaign for Accuracy in Public Health Research. All these things sound very oriented towards consumer advocacy. And it's hard to know unless you're a journalist or someone else know where to look. It's hard to know they're being funded by chemical industry interests. And they're essentially being directed, you know, towards propaganda to support the safety of the products that these companies profit from. And there's a number of them out there. And yeah, they're all over Twitter, they're all over social media, and their job is to discredit and harass and suppress anybody who in any way threatens the agenda of these corporations who help finance them.
Well, now's a good time to talk about the real grassroots groups like Moms Across America and Labeled GMOs. And I'm friends with several of these people. Zen Honeycutt is in your book, Pam Larry, Stacy Malkin. Can you talk about some of these heroes and what you think they've been able to achieve?
Yeah, I mean, what I write about it a bit in the book. I mean, there's so many different examples. It's hard to just pick one, but people who are becoming educated, becoming informed, and becoming engaged, and not waiting for the government to take care of them or to solve this. And yeah, Zen obviously is been a game changer and really aggressive on this front, and so have so many others. But you have to admire that. I'm not an activist. I don't get out and march and, you know, hold signs and sign petitions and things like that. I just do my best to do research that can help inform people. But I'm so impressed and I guess in awe of the people who do tirelessly get out there, and you and your show, you know, and get out there and share the information, because when you're informed and you're educated, that's how you can affect change. And that's how you can make decisions about, you know, what you want to eat and what you want to feed your children and what public policies you want to support and what, you know, lawmakers you want to vote for. If we don't have the information, we can't make smart decisions. So
yeah, well, you know, it's interesting because so many of the institutions that enable us to have a democracy are getting co-opted by corporations. I feel the education system is getting co-opted by charter schools. The universities are getting co-opted by people like the Koch brothers, who buy, for example, entire economics departments at universities. The media is getting co-opted. You know, Comcast owns NBC and MSNBC, and they make fun of Sinclair Broadcasting and how Sinclair had its anchors, you know, talk about how they don't want to air fake news and stuff. And then they come out, the MSNBC has a whole panel on Comcast Cares. And Comcast pursues some horrible policies, like trying to eliminate net neutrality, for instance. And net neutrality is what gives me and other independent journalists an equal voice with some of those big media outlets. So that leads me to a question that I wanted to ask you about Reuters. So Reuters, as you told me, is not supported by advertising. It's supported by its financial services that it provides to banks and investment firms like Bloomberg. Had your editors ever tried to interfere with your reporting?
So yes, that was a long answer, I think, is what I explained to you earlier. Over my 17 years at Reuters, most of my time there, I had an editor who really didn't give a darn if Monsanto called and screamed and yelled and stomped its feet, which it did a lot. And the agrochemical industry lobbyist organizations would call and would write letters and would want to have meetings. And we, really worked very diligently on me, as I know they do on other journalists, to try to control the narrative, to try to control the way you report the stories. And they worked very hard on me to do that. And fortunately, unfortunately, I don't know. I've got a strong backbone and I don't actually care when people, hammer on me. I think it means I'm probably doing my job correctly. If they can't find a problem with the facts, I don't want to hear about it. And, they could never find a problem with the facts. So we were fine. I got a new editor in 2014-ish. That editor didn't really know anything about food and agriculture, didn't have a background here, didn't understand this game, this corporate propaganda pressure game, and was really nervous about it, and did want to try to take me off the beat. I had to go to his boss overruled him. It went on and on. The gentleman who was my boss at that time is no longer at Reuters. It became a very difficult place to try to continue to tell the stories that we wanted to tell about Monsanto and others. So I decided it was better to go ahead and leave and write the book and continue to do research now for U.S. Right to Know, this nonprofit consumer group.
Yes, and so viewers know, the book, you supported yourself and were able to travel for the book based on an advance from your publisher.
Yeah, it was, I just want to say it was kind of good. So the publisher came to me. They actually came to me when I was working at Reuters and said, could you write a book? This is really interesting stuff. And I said, no one's going to read a book about pesticides, for crying out loud, But they convinced me that, somebody would read it. And so gave me an advance and a contract and worked very hard to support the book. And I'm very pleased with it. And the book has done well. And I'm happy about that. I'm happy that people are interested and do care, and are getting engaged.
Well, there's a lot of interesting stories in the book, and I don't want to talk about all of them because I really want people to go out and buy this book, and I'm holding it up.
There you go. Yeah.
This is Low Tech, folks. The story of a weed killer, cancer, and the corruption of science. But there was one thing that surprised me. Well, there was a lot of, obviously, the general gist of the book was not surprising to me. All the details I didn't know. But there was one thing that was very surprising and saddening to me, because I've been to both Kauai and Maui. And that was the fact that these two islands in Hawaii are being used for, what did you call them? Experimental fields to test these chemicals. And we're not just talking about glyphosate. So can you talk about what they've done in Hawaii, how it's harmed the people, and what the people are doing to fight back?
Yeah, and that is just tragic. If you think about how beautiful, right? It's paradise. The Hawaiian Islands are. We all think of them that way. And people want to go and travel there and vacation because it's so beautiful. But Kauai, in particular, and some of the other areas on the other islands became very attractive to the genetically engineered seed companies, to Monsanto and DuPont and the others who are developing these new genetically engineered seeds that they work in conjunction, obviously, with a lot of these different pesticides. And so they started buying up and leasing land, buying land to establish these test fields. And they're not just doing this like we do in the United States, like seasonally, like, you grow corn one year and then you have one corn crop per farmer. This is year round. This is Hawaii. You've got warm weather all year. You've got nice seasonal tropical winds, and this is year round. And the people who live on these little islands, near these test fields, are essentially being exposed to these chemicals just day in and day out. And children in school, it's been documented, these residues are infiltrating their schools. Children are being sickened. The doctors are reporting increases in birth defects, a whole different array of just devastating health impacts as well as environmental impacts. And the people have been trying to fight back and trying to pass laws to restrict the use of these chemicals, to get more information about these chemicals, to establish buffer zones between schools and neighborhoods. And the chemical companies have fought back on every single thing. They don't want to tell them what they're spraying. They don't want to tell them when. They don't want to reduce it. They don't want buffer zones. It's been really hard for those people there.
Now, has Monsanto ever tried to threaten you or intimidate you to stop your reporting?
Well, they definitely tried to intimidate me. I mean, that's just par for the course. That was, I remember years ago, I had one Monsanto. I mean, I've been yelled at, I've been, harassed. They mainly, the attacks are mainly now on social media. I'm called an enemy of all humanity. I want to see everyone starve because I'm not a fan of pesticides. I'm a horrible human being. I don't know, all sorts of things. Yeah. So, I mean, there are a lot of different things, and there are a lot of farmers that I am talking to on a daily basis. There are networks of these farmers who are looking at regenerative agriculture is something that they talk about, not necessarily organic, but practices that restore the health of the soil. By restoring the health of your soil, you're going to have a healthier plant. You're going to have crops that aren't as susceptible to disease, so you're not going to need fungicides. There are time-honored and proven techniques to fight insects and weeds without chemicals, and so they're perfecting these strategies. There really are a lot of tools out there besides synthetic pesticides to address weeds and disease and insects and things like that. Farmers have been doing this for a long time, and farmers can continue to do that, but it's not in the interest of the chemical companies for that to happen. Their answer, and what we're seeing right now with weed resistance, for instance, weed resistance is developed because of this overuse of glyphosate on millions of acres of farm country around the United States. The chemical company's answer is, well, let's combine glyphosate with dicamba. Let's combine glyphosate with 2,4-D. Let's combine these synthetic pesticides and use more of them on new genetically engineered crops. It's a vicious cycle. It's a vicious treadmill. But a number of companies, food companies, farmers, and consumers around the country are starting to say, no, we don't want that. That's not the way we're going to do it. And they're pushing for new practices. And, I find that encouraging because we need balance. This is I'm not someone who stands up and says we need to ban all pesticides. I'm not smart enough to figure out how we do this. I'm simply bringing the information out to light, and there are other ways. We don't have to have a pesticide dependent food system. Well, that is a great question. I mean, the main concerns are that when you combine these two already very large and powerful companies, you're going to have one behemoth, right? You're going to have one much more powerful company. And this one bigger company is going to have not only more influence potentially in Washington, D.C. and with the European regulatory agencies and others around the world, but they're going to have a greater share of these seeds and these chemicals, which make it harder for farmers, reduces choices, can increase prices. That's why they want to merge, essentially, to have more power and to have more profit potential. So there's a lot of concern that farmers and consumers, as an extension, are going to be hurt with ever limited choices. Just with Monsanto, and Syngenta, with this handful of 4 or 5 big companies that are now reduced to about 3 companies, we already were seeing limited seed choice, for instance. And we can just expect more of that with this merger. Yeah, so there are 2 different tracks, really. There is the federal litigation, and this is referred to as multi-district litigation, or MDL. And these are cases that are all sort of put on one track under one judge in San Francisco, U.S. District Court, Judge Shabria. And that's very compelling stuff going on there. There, like I said, 404 last count lawsuits in that MDL. Separately, there are several thousand plaintiffs who have filed lawsuits in state courts in Missouri and Arizona and Texas and California and all over the country. And one of those, which is out in California, but it's in the state court, is slated for trial June 18. And, that's very, very exciting. It's very historic potentially. And it's a man, Dwayne Johnson, who has non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and he's near death. They are not certain at all that he will even survive to see this trial. Monsanto's been asking to delay the trial, but the judge has said no. This man deserves his day in court, so we shall see. We don't seem to like to follow the lead of anybody, so I'm not sure. Europe definitely, as you said, has a much more precautionary way of looking at these chemicals. As you've seen in the news lately, they've looked to extend restrictions. They've just recently voted to extend restrictions on neonicotinoids, this class of very popular insecticides, because of the harm that they do specifically to bees, to biodiversity, to environment. The chemical industry's having a fit over that, but it's very important because there's documented harm associated with these neonicotinoids. They are much quicker to ban other chemicals than the United States is. There are chemicals that are banned there that we still allow here in the United States. The European Parliament voted to ban glyphosate in October, but in a very narrow vote of the whole European Commission, it slid through with a reauthorization or reapproval for another 5 years. But at the same time, you have Germany and France and others looking to restrict or ban glyphosate right now. So, yeah, Europe is way ahead of us in terms of recognizing endocrine disruption, properties associated with these chemicals, and really looking at the long run. We're harming our health. We're harming the health of our future generations by exposing our children and our vulnerable population routinely to these pesticides that we know have health risks. And having them in our food and our water and our soil and our own bodies is not a good thing. And in the United States, my view on it is we seem to worship wealth. We worship power and money and profit. And, that's a good thing to a certain extent. But when it comes to human health and the food we eat, I think we need to get the money out of Washington. We need to not be so enamored of the corporate dollar. Well, I do think it can be as personal as you want, or as profound as you want. So it may be just you want to, like me, I want to buy organic strawberries. I love strawberries. My kids love strawberries. I want to buy organic strawberries and organic milk, and I want to have as reduced pesticide loads in the foods I feed my kids as possible. But again, I don't have the energy or time or the acclimation to get out and march, but a lot of people do. And if you care about it and you want to reach out to lawmakers, or you want to reach out to your city council, or you just want to tell your neighborhood, lawn care company, hey, be alert, be aware, be interested. It's all about sharing information and educating ourselves, educating others, so that we, again, can make decisions that are best for ourselves and best for our children and best for our future.
Great. Thank you so much.